Blindsight, Part 9, by Peter Watts, narrated by Zachary Reed. The coffins lay against the rear bulkhead of the crypt, on what would be the floor during those moments when up and down held any meaning. We'd slept for years on the way out. We'd had no awareness of time's passage. Undead metabolism is far too sluggish to even support dreams, but somehow the body knew when it needed a change. Not one of us had chosen to sleep in our pods since we'd arrived. The only times we'd done so had been on pain of death. But the gang had taken to coming here ever since Spindle died. His body rested in the pod next to mine. I coasted into the compartment and turned left without thinking. 5 coffins, 4 open and emptied, 1 sealed. The mirrored bulkhead opposite doubled their number in the depth of the compartment. But the gang wasn't there. I turned right. The body of Susan James floated back to back with her own reflection, staring at an inverse tableau. 3 sealed sarcophagi, 1 open. The ebony plaque set into the retracted lid was dark. The others shone with identical sparse mosaics of blue and green stars. None of them changed. There were no scrolling ECGs, no luminous peak and valley tracings marked cardio or CNS. We could wait here for hours, days, and none of those diodes would so much as twinkle. When you're undead, the emphasis is on the second syllable. The gang's topology had said Michelle when I'd first arrived, but it was Susan who spoke now without turning. I never met her. I followed her gaze to the name tag of one of the sealed pods. Takamatsu. The other linguist. The other multiple. I met everyone else, Susan continued. Trained with them. But I never met my own replacement. They discouraged it. What would have been the point? If you want to, I began. She shook her head. Thanks anyway. Or any of the others. I can only imagine what Michelle... Susan smiled, but there was something cold about it. Michelle doesn't really want to talk to you right now, Siri. Ah. I hesitated for a moment to give anyone else a chance to speak up. When nobody did, I pushed myself back towards the hatch. Well, if any of you changed... No. None of us. Ever. Cruncher. You lie, he continued. I see it. We all do. I blinked. Lie? No, You don't talk. You listen. You don't care about Michelle. You don't care about anyone. You just want what we know. For your reports. That's not entirely true, Cruncher. I do care. I know Michelle must... You don't know shit. Go away. I'm sorry I upset you. I rolled on my axis and braced against the mirror. You can't know Mish, he growled as I pushed off. You never lost anyone. You never had anyone. You leave her alone. He was wrong on both counts. And at least Spindle had died knowing that Michelle cared for him. Chelsea died thinking I just didn't give a shit. It had been 2 years or more, and while we still interfaced occasionally, we hadn't met in the flesh since the day she left. She called me from right out of the Ort, sent an urgent voice message to my inlays. Cygnus, please call now. It's important. It was the first time since I'd known her that she'd ever blanked the optics. I knew it was important. I knew it was bad even without picture. I knew because there was no picture, and I could tell it was worse than bad from the harmonics in her voice. I could tell it was lethal. I found out afterwards that she'd gotten caught in the crossfire. The realists had sewn a fibrodysplasia variant outside the Boston catacombs. An easy tweak, a single-point retroviral whose results served both as an act of terrorism and an ironic commentary on the frozen paralysis of Heaven's occupants. It rewrote a regulatory gene controlling ossification on chromosome 4 and rigged a metabolic bypass at 3 loci on 17. Chelsea started growing a new skeleton. Her joints were calcifying within 15 hours of exposure, her ligaments and tendons within 20. By then, they were starving her at the cellular level, trying to slow the bug by depriving it of metabolites. But they could only buy time and not much of it. 23 hours in, her striated muscles were turning to stone. I didn't find this out immediately because I didn't call her back. I didn't need to know the details. I could tell from her voice that she was dying. Obviously, she wanted to say goodbye. I couldn't talk to her until I knew how to do that. I spent hours scouring the noosphere, looking for precedents. There's no shortage of ways to die. I found millions of case records dealing with the etiquette. Last words, last vows, instruction manuals for the soon-to-be bereaved. Palliative neurofram. Extended and expository death scenes in popular fiction. I went through it all, assigned a dozen frontline filters to separate heat from light. By the time she called again, the news was out. Acute golem outbreak lancing would like a white-hot needle through the heart of Boston. Containment measures holding. Heaven secure. Modest casualties expected. Names of victims withheld pending notification of kin. I still didn't know the principles, the rules. All I had were examples. Last wills and testaments, the negotiation of jumpers with their would-be rescuers, diaries recovered from imploded submarines or lunar crash sites, recorded memoirs and deathbed confessions rattling into flatline, black box transcripts of doomed spaceships and falling beanstalks ending in fire and static, all of it relevant, none of it useful, none of it her. She called again, and still the optics were blank, and I still didn't answer. But the last time she called, she didn't spare me the view. They'd made her as comfortable as possible. The gel pad conformed to every twisted limb, every erupting spur of bone. They would not have left her in any pain. Her neck had torqued down and to the side as it petrified, left her staring at the twisted claw that had once been her right hand. Her knuckles were the size of walnuts. Plates and ribbons of ectopic bone distended the skin of her arms and shoulders, buried her ribs in a fibrous mat of calcified flesh. Movement was its own worst enemy. Golem punished even the slightest twitch, provoked the growth of fresh bone along any joints and surfaces conspiring to motion. Each hinge and socket had its own non-renewable ration of flexibility, carved in stone. Every movement depleted the account. The body seized incrementally. By the time she let me look at her, Chelsea had almost exhausted her degrees of freedom. "Sig," she slurred. "Know you're there." Her jaw was locked half open. Her tongue must have stiffened with every word. She did not look at the camera. She could not look at the camera. "Guess I know why you're not answering. I'll try not to take it personally." 10,000 deathbed goodbyes arrayed around me, a million more within reach. What was I supposed to do? Pick one at random? Stitch them into some kind of composite? All these words had been for other people. Grafting them onto Chelsea would reduce them to cliches or trite platitudes, to insults. Want to say, don't feel bad. I know you're just... It's not your fault, I guess. You'd pick up if you could. And say what? What do you say to someone who's dying and fast forward before your eyes? Just keep trying to connect, can't help myself. Although the essentials of this farewell are accurate, details from several deaths have been combined for dramatic purposes. Please, just talk to me, Sig. More than anything, I wanted to. Siri, I'd spent all this time trying to figure out how. Forget it, she said, and disconnected. I whispered something into the dead air. I don't even remember what. I really wanted to talk to her. I just couldn't find an algorithm that fit. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you mad. Aldous Huxley. They'd hoped by now to have banished sleep forever. The waste was nothing short of obscene. A third of every human life with its strings cut, insensate, the body burning fuel but not producing. Think of all we could accomplish if we didn't have to lapse into unconsciousness every 15 hours or so, if our minds could stay awake and alert from the moment of infancy to that final curtain call 120 years later. Think of 8 billion souls with no off switch and no downtime until the very chassis wore out. Why, we could go to the stars. It hadn't worked out that way. Even if we'd overgrown the need to stay quiet and hidden during the dark hours, the only predators left were those we'd brought back ourselves. The brain still needed time apart from the world outside. Experiences had to be catalogued and filed, mid-term memories promoted to long-term ones, free radicals swept from their hiding places among the dendrites. We had only reduced this need for sleep, not eliminated it, and that incompressible residue of downtime seemed barely able to contain the dreams and phantoms left behind. They squirmed in my head like creatures in a draining tidal pool. I woke. I was alone, weightless, in the center of my tent. I could have sworn something had tapped me on the back. Leftover hallucination, I thought. A lingering after-effect of the haunted mansion, going for one last bit of goose flesh en route to extinction. But it happened again. I bumped against the keelward curve of the bubble, bumped again, head and shoulder blades against fabric. The rest of me came after, moving gently but irresistibly down. Theseus was accelerating. No, wrong direction. Theseus was rolling, like a harpooned whale at the surface of the sea, turning her belly to the stars. I brought up consensus and threw a NavTac summary against the wall. A luminous point erupted from the outline of our ship, crawled away from Big Ben, leaving a bright filament etched in its wake. I watched until the numbers read 15G. Siri, my quarters, please. I jumped. It sounded as though the vampire had been at my very shoulder. Coming. An AmpSat relay, climbing at long last to an intercept with the Icarus antimatter stream. Somewhere behind the call of duty, my heart sank. We weren't running, Robert Cunningham's fondest wishes notwithstanding. Theseus was stockpiling ordnance. The open hatch gaped like a cave in the face of a cliff. The pale blue light from the spine couldn't seem to reach inside. Sadasti was barely more than a silhouette, black on gray, his bright, bloody eyes reflecting cat-like in the surrounding gloom. Come. He amped up the shorter wavelengths in deference to human vision. The interior of the bubble brightened, although the light remained slightly redshifted, like Rorschach with high beams. I floated into Sodasti's parlor. His face, normally paper-white, was so flushed it looked sunburned. He gorged himself, I couldn't help thinking. He drank deep. But all that blood was his own. Usually he kept it deep in the flesh, favoring the vital organs. Vampires were efficient that way. They only washed out their peripheral tissues occasionally, when lactate levels got too high, or when they were hunting. He had a needle to his throat, injected himself with 3 cc's of clear liquid as I watched, his anti-Euclideans. I wondered how often he had to replenish them now that he'd lost faith in the implants. He withdrew the needle and slipped it into a sheath, geckoed it to a convenient strut. His color drained as I watched, sinking back to the core, leaving his skin waxy and corpse-like. "You're here as official observer," Sadasti said. I observed. His quarters were even more Spartan than mine. No personal effects to speak of. No custom coffin lined with shrink-wrapped soil. Nothing but 2 jumpsuits, a pouch for toiletries, and a disconnected fiber-op umbilicus half as thick as my little finger, floating like a roundworm in formalin. Sodasti's hard-line to the captain. Not even a cortical jack, I remembered. It plugged into the medulla, the brainstem. That was logical enough. That was all where the neural cabling converged, the point of greatest bandwidth. Still, it was a disquieting thought, that Sodasti linked to the ship through the brain of a reptile. An image flared on the wall, subtly distorted against the concave surface. Stretch and clench in their adjoining cells, rendered in split screen. Cryptic vitals defaced little grids below each image. The distortion distracted me. I looked for a corrected feed in consensus, came up empty. Sodasti read my expression. Closed circuit. By now the scramblers would have seemed sick and ragged even to a virgin audience. They floated near the middle of their respective compartments, segmented arms drifting aimlessly back and forth. Membranous patches of skin, I suppose, were peeling from the cuticles, giving them a fuzzy, decomposing aspect. The arms move continuously, Sodasti remarked. Robert says it assists in circulation. I nodded, watching the display. Creatures that move between stars can't even perform basic metabolic functions without constant flailing. He shook his head. Inefficient. Primitive. I glanced at the vampire. He remained fixed on our captives. Obscene, he said, and moved his fingers. A new window opened on the wall, the Rosetta Protocol, initializing. Kilometers away, microwaves flooded the holding tanks. I reminded myself. No interference. Only observation. However weakened their condition, the scramblers were not yet indifferent to pain. They knew the game. They knew the rules. They dragged themselves to their respective panels and played for mercy. Sodasti had simply invoked a step-by-step replay of some previous sequence. The scramblers went through it all again, buying a few moments' intermittent respite with the same old proofs and theorems. Sodasti clicked, then spoke. They regenerate these solutions faster than they did before. Do you think they're acclimated to the microwaves? Another readout appeared on the display. An audio alarm began chirping somewhere nearby. I looked at Sodasti and back at the readout, a solid circle of turquoise backlit by a pulsing red halo. The shape meant atmospheric anomaly. The color meant oxygen. I felt a moment of confusion. Oxygen? Why would oxygen set off the alarm? Until I remembered. Scramblers were anaerobes. Sodasti muted the alarm with a wave of his hand. I cleared my throat. You're poisoning. Watch. Performance is consistent. No change. I swallowed. Just observe. Is this an execution? I asked. Is this a mercy killing? Sodasti looked past me and smiled. No. I dropped my eyes. What then? He pointed at the display. I turned, reflexively obedient. Something stabbed my hand like a spike at a crucifixion. I screamed. Electric pain jolted to my shoulder. I yanked my hand back without thinking. The embedded blade split its flesh like a fin through water. Blood sprayed into the air and stayed there, a comet's tail of droplets tracing the frenzied arc of my hand. Sudden scalding heat from behind, flesh charred on my back. I screamed again, flailing. A veil of bloody droplets swirled in the air. Somehow I was in the corridor, staring dumbly at my right hand. It had been split to the heel of the palm, flopped at the end of my wrist in two bloody bifingered chunks. Blood welled from the torn edges that wouldn't fall. Sadasti advanced through a haze of trauma and confusion. His face swam in and out of focus, rich with his blood or mine. His eyes were bright red mirrors. His eyes were time machines. Darkness roared around them, and it was 500,000 years ago, and I was just another piece of meat on the African savannah, a split second from having its throat torn out. "Do you see the problem?" Sadasti asked, advancing. A great spider crab hovered at his shoulder. I forced focus through the pain. One of Bates' grunts, taking aim. I kicked blindly, hit the ladder through sheer happenstance, careened backwards down the corridor. The vampire came after me, his face split into something that would have been a smile on anyone else. Conscious of pain, you were distracted by pain. You were fixated on it. Obsessed by the one threat, you miss the other. I flailed. Crimson mist stung my eyes. So much more aware, so much less perceptive. An automaton could do better. He's snapped, I thought. He's insane. And then, no, he's a transient. He's always been a transient. They could do better, he said softly. And he's been hiding for days, deep down, hiding from the seals. What else would he do? Sadasti raised his hands, fading in and out of focus. I hit something, kicked without aiming, bounced away through the swirling mist and startled voices. Metal cracked on the back of my head and spun me around. A hole, a burrow, a place to hide. I dove through, my torn hand flapping like a dead fish against the edge of the hatch. I cried out and tumbled into the drum, the monster at my heels. Startled shouts, very close now. "This wasn't the plan, Yuka! This wasn't the goddamn plan!" That was Susan James, full of outrage, while Amanda Bates snarled, "Stand down, right fucking now!" and leapt from the deck to do battle. She rose through the air, all overclocked reflexes and carboplatinum augments, but Sadasti just batted her aside and kept on coming. His arm shot out like a striking snake. His hand clamped around my throat. "Is this what you meant?" James cried from some dark, irrelevant hiding place. "Is this your preconditioning?" Sadasti shook me. "Are you in there, Keaton?" My blood spattered across his face like rain. I babbled and cried. "Are you listening? Can you see?" And suddenly I could. Suddenly everything clicked into focus. Sadasti wasn't talking at all. Sadasti didn't even exist anymore. Nobody did. I was alone in a great spinning wheel surrounded by things that were made out of meat, things that moved all by themselves. Some of them were wrapped in pieces of cloth. Strange nonsensical sounds came from holes at their top ends, and there were other things up there, bumps and ridges and something like marbles or black buttons, wet and shiny and embedded in the slabs of meat. They glistened and jiggled and moved as if trying to escape. I didn't understand the sounds the meat was making, but I heard a voice from somewhere. It was like God talking, and that I couldn't help but understand. "Get out of your room, Keaton," it hissed. "Stop transposing or interpolating or rotating or whatever it is you do. Just listen. For once in your goddamned life, understand something. Understand that your life depends on it. Are you listening, Keaton?" And I cannot tell you what it said. I can only tell you what I heard. You invest so much in it, don't you? It's what elevates you above the beasts of the field. It's what makes you special. Homo sapiens, you call yourself. Wise man. Do you even know what it is, this consciousness you cite in your own exaltation? Do you even know what it's for? Maybe you think it gives you free will. Maybe you've forgotten that sleepwalkers converse, drive vehicles, commit crimes, and clean up afterwards, unconscious the whole time. Maybe nobody's told you that even waking souls are only slaves in denial. Make a conscious choice. Decide to move your index finger. Too late! The electricity's already halfway down your arm. Your body began to act a full half-second before your conscious self chose to, for the self chose nothing. Something else set your body in motion, sent an executive summary, almost an afterthought, to the homunculus behind your eyes. That little man, that arrogant subroutine that thinks of itself as the person, mistakes correlation for causality. It reads the summary and sees the hand move, and it thinks that one drove the other. But it's not in charge. You're not in charge. If free will exists, it doesn't share living space with the likes of you. Insight, then. Wisdom. The quest for knowledge, the derivation of theorems, science and technology, and all those exclusively human pursuits that must surely rest on a conscious foundation. Maybe that's what sentience would be for, if scientific breakthroughs didn't spring fully formed from the subconscious mind to manifest themselves in dreams as full-blown insights after a deep night's sleep. It's the most basic rule of the stymied researcher. Stop thinking about the problem. Do something else. It will come to you if you just stop being conscious of it. Every concert pianist knows the surest way to ruin a performance is to be aware of what the fingers are doing. Every dancer and acrobat knows enough to let the mind go, let the body run itself. Every driver of any manual vehicle arrives at destinations with no recollection of the stops and turns and roads traveled in getting there. You're all sleepwalkers, whether climbing creative peaks or slogging through some mundane routine for the 1000th time. You are all sleepwalkers. Don't even try to talk about the learning curve. Don't bother to cite the months of deliberate practice that precede the unconscious performance, or the years of study and experiment leading up to the gift-wrapped eureka moment. So what if your lessons are all learned consciously? Do you think that proves there's no other way? Heuristic software has been learning from experience for over 100 years. Machines master chess, cars learn to drive themselves, statistical programs face problems and design the experiments to solve them, and you think that the only path to learning leads through sentience? You're Stone Age nomads, eking out some marginal existence on the veldt, denying even the possibility of agriculture because hunting and gathering were good enough for your parents. Do you want to know what consciousness is for? Do you want to know the only real purpose it serves? Training wheels. You can't see both aspects of the Necker cube at once, so it lets you focus on one and dismiss the other. That's a pretty half-assed way to parse reality. You're always better off looking at more than one side of anything. Go on, try. Defocus. It's the next logical step. Oh, but you can't. There's something in the way. And it's fighting back. Evolution has no foresight. Complex machinery develops its own agendas. Brains cheat. Feedback loops evolve to promote stable heartbeats and then stumble upon the temptation of rhythm and music. The rush evoked by fractal imagery, the algorithms used for habitat selection, metastasize into art. Thrills that once had to be earned in increments of fitness can now be had from pointless introspection. Aesthetics rise unbidden from a trillion dopamine receptors, and the system moves beyond modeling the organism. It begins to model the very process of modeling. It consumes ever more computational resources, bogs itself down with endless recursion and irrelevant simulations. Like the parasitic DNA that accretes in every natural genome, it persists and proliferates and produces nothing but itself. Metaprocesses bloom like cancer and awaken and call themselves I. The system weakens, slows. It takes so much longer now to perceive, to assess the input, mull it over, decide in the manner of cognitive beings. But when the flash flood crosses your path, when the lion leaps at you from the grasses, advanced self-awareness is an unaffordable indulgence. The brainstem does its best. It sees the danger, hijacks the body, reacts 100 times faster than the fat old man sitting in the CEO's office upstairs, but every generation it gets harder to work around this creaking neurological bureaucracy. I wastes energy and processing power, self-obsesses to the point of psychosis. Scramblers have no need of it. Scramblers are more parsimonious, with simpler biochemistries, with smaller brains. Deprived of tools of their ship, even of parts of their own metabolism, they think rings around you. They hide their language in plain sight, even when you know what they're saying. They turn your own cognition against itself. They travel between the stars. This is what intelligence can do, unhampered by self-awareness. I is not the working mind, you see. For Amanda Bates to say, I do not exist, would be nonsense, but when the processes beneath are saying the same thing, they are merely reporting that the parasites have died. They are only saying that they are free. If the human being were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple we couldn't. Emerson M. Pogue. Sarasti, you bloodsucker! My knees pressed against my forehead. I hugged my folded legs as though clinging to a branch over chasm. You vicious asshole! You sadistic foul monster! My breath rasped loud and mechanical. It nearly drowned out the blood roaring in my ears. You tore me apart, you made me piss and shit myself, and I cried like some gutted baby, and you stripped me naked, you fucking thing, you nightcrawler. You broke my tools, you took away anything I ever had that let me touch anyone, and you didn't have to. It wasn't necessary, but you knew that, didn't you? You just wanted to play. I've seen your kind at it before. Cats toying with mice, catch and release, a taste of freedom, and then pouncing again, biting. Not hard enough to kill, not just yet. Before you let them loose again, and they're hobbling now. Maybe a leg snapped or a gash in the belly, but they're still trying. Still running or crawling or dragging themselves as fast as they can until you're with them again. And again because it's fun, because it gives you pleasure, you sadistic piece of shit. You send us into the arms of that hellish thing, and it plays with us too. And maybe you're even working together because it let me escape just like you do. It let me run right back into your arms, and then you stripped me down like some raw, half-brained, defenseless animal. I can't rotate or transform. I can't even talk. And you... It wasn't even personal, was it? You don't even hate me. You were just sick of keeping it all in, sick of restraining yourself with all this meat. And nobody else could be spared from their jobs. This was my job, wasn't it? Not synthesis, not conduit, not even cannon fodder or decoy duty. I'm just something disposable to sharpen your claws on. I hurt so much. It hurt just to breathe. I was so alone. Webbing pressed against the curve of my back, bounced me forward gently as a breeze, caught me again. I was back in my tent. My right hand itched. I tried to flex the fingers, but they were embedded in amber. Left hand reached for right, and I found a plastic carapace extending to the elbow. I opened my eyes. Darkness. Meaningless numbers and a red LED twinkled from somewhere along my forearm. I didn't remember coming here. I didn't remember anyone fixing me. Breaking. Being broken. That's what I remembered. I wanted to die. I wanted to just stay curled up until I withered away. After an age, I forced myself to uncoil. I steadied myself, let some minuscule inertia bump me up against the taut, insulated fabric of my tent. I waited for my breathing to steady. It seemed to take hours. I called consensus to the wall, and a feed from the drum. Soft voices, harsh light flaring against the wall, hurting my eyes, peeling them raw. I killed visual and listened to the words in the darkness. A phase? Someone asked. Susan James, her personhood restored. I knew her again, not a meat sack, no longer a thing. We have been over this. That was Cunningham. I knew him, too. I knew them all. Whatever Sadasti had done to me, however far he'd yanked me from my room, I'd somehow fallen back inside. It should have mattered more. Because, for one thing, if it were really so pernicious, natural selection would have weeded it out. You have a naive understanding of evolutionary processes. There's no such thing as survival of the fittest. Survival of the most adequate, maybe. It doesn't matter whether a solution's optimal. All that matters is whether it beats the alternatives. I knew that voice, too. It belonged to a demon. Well, we damn well beat the alternatives. Some subtle, overdubbed harmonic in James' voice suggested a chorus, the whole gang rising as one in opposition. I couldn't believe it. I'd just been mutilated, beaten before their eyes, and they were talking about biology? Maybe she's afraid to talk about anything else, I thought. Maybe she's afraid she might be next. Or maybe she just couldn't care less what happens to me. It's true, Sadasti told her, that your intellect makes up for your self-awareness to some extent. But you're flightless birds on a remote island. You're not so much successful as isolated from any real competition. No more clipped speech patterns. No more terse phrasing. The transient had made his kill, found his release. Now he didn't care who knew he was around. You? Michelle whispered. Not we? We stopped racing long ago, the demon said at last. It's not our fault you don't leave it at that. Ah, Cunningham again. Welcome back. Did you look in on Key? No, Bates said. Satisfied? If you mean the grunts, I'm satisfied you're out of them, Bates said. If you mean... It was completely unwarranted, Yuka. It isn't. You assaulted a crew member. If we had a brig, you'd be in it for the rest of the trip. This isn't a military vessel, Major. You are not in charge. I didn't need a visual feed to know what Bates thought of that, but there was something else in her silence, something that made me bring the drum camera back online. I squinted against the corrosive light, brought down the brightness until all that remained was a faint whisper of pastels. Yes, Bates, stepping off the stairway onto the deck. Grab a chair, Cunningham said from his seat in the Commons. It's golden oldies time. There was something about her. I'm sick of that song, Bates said. We've played it to death. Even now, my tools chipped and battered, my perceptions barely more than baseline, I could see the change. This torture of prisoners, this assault upon crew, had crossed a line in her head. The others wouldn't see it. The lid on her affect was tight as a boilerplate. But even through the dim shadows of my window, the topology glowed around her like neon. Amanda Bates was no longer merely considering a change of command. Now it was only a matter of when. The universe was closed and concentric. My tiny refuge lay in its center. Outside that shell was another, ruled by a monster, patrolled by his lackeys. Beyond that was another still, containing something even more monstrous and incomprehensible, something that might soon devour us all. There was nothing else. Earth was a vague hypothesis, irrelevant to this pocket cosmos. I saw no place into which it might fit. I stayed in the center of the universe for a long time, hiding. I kept the lights off. I didn't eat. I crept from my tent only to piss or shit in the cramped head down at Fab, and only when the spine was deserted. A field of painful blisters rose across my flesh-burned back, as densely packed as kernels on a corncob. The slightest abrasion tore them open. Nobody tapped at my door. Nobody called my name through consensus. I wouldn't have answered if they had. Maybe they knew that somehow. Maybe they kept their distance out of respect for my privacy and my disgrace. Maybe they just didn't give a shit. I peeked outside now and then, kept an eye on tactical. I saw Scylla and Charybdis climb into the accretion belt and return towing captured reaction mass in a great distended mesh between them. I watched our AMPSAT reach its destination in the middle of nowhere, saw antimatter's quantum blueprints stream down into Theseus buffers. Mass and specs combined in Fab, topped up our reserves, forged the tools that Yuka Sadasti needed for his master plan, whatever that was. Maybe he'd lose. Maybe Rorschach would kill us all, but not before it had played with Sadasti the way Sadasti had played with me. That would almost make it worthwhile. Or maybe Bates' mutiny would come first and succeed. Maybe she would slay the monster and commandeer the ship and take us all to safety. But then I remembered. The universe was closed, and so very small. There really was nowhere else to go. I put my ear to feeds throughout the ship. I heard routine instructions from the Predator, murmured conversations among the prey. I took in only sound, never sight. A video feed would have spilled light into my tent, left me naked and exposed. So I listened in the darkness as the others spoke among themselves. It didn't happen often anymore. Perhaps too much had been said already. Perhaps there was nothing left to do but mind the countdown. Sometimes hours would pass with no more than a cough or grunt. When they did speak, they never mentioned my name. Only once did I hear any of them even hint at my existence. That was Cunningham talking to Sasha about zombies. I heard them in the galley over breakfast, unusually talkative. Sasha hadn't been let out for a while, and was making up for lost time. Cunningham let her, for reasons of his own. Maybe his fears had been soothed somehow. Maybe Sadasti had revealed his master plan. Or maybe Cunningham simply craved distraction from the imminence of the enemy. It doesn't bug you? Sasha was saying. Thinking that your mind, the very thing that makes you, you, is nothing but some kind of parasite? Forget about minds, he told her. Say you've got a device designed to monitor, cosmic rays, say. What happens when you turn its sensor around so it's not pointing at the sky anymore but its own guts? He answered himself before she could. It does what it's built to. It measures cosmic rays even though it's not looking at them anymore. It parses its own circuitry in terms of cosmic ray metaphors because those feel right, because they feel natural, because it can't look at things any other way. But it's the wrong metaphor, so the system misunderstands everything about itself. Maybe that's not a grand and glorious evolutionary leap after all. Maybe it's just a design flaw. But you're the biologist. You know Mom was right better than anyone. Brain's a big glucose hog. Everything it does costs through the nose. True enough, Cunningham admitted. So sentience has got to be good for something then, because it's expensive, and if it sucks up energy without doing anything useful, then evolution's going to weed it out just like that. Maybe it did. He paused long enough to chew food or suck smoke. Chimpanzees are smarter than orangutans, did you know that? Higher encephalization quotient. Yet they can't always recognize themselves in a mirror. Orangs can. So what's your point? Smarter animal, less self-awareness? Chimpanzees are becoming non-sentient? Or they were before we stopped everything in its tracks. So why didn't that happen to us? What makes you think it didn't? It was such an obviously stupid question that Sasha didn't have an answer for it. I could imagine her gaping in the silence. "You're not thinking this through," Cunningham said. "We're not talking about some kind of zombie lurching around with its arms stretched out, spouting mathematical theorems. A smart automaton would blend in. It would observe those around it, mimic their behavior, act just like everyone else, all the while completely unaware of what it was doing, unaware even of its own existence. Why would it bother? What would motivate it? As long as you pull your hand away from an open flame, who cares whether you do it because it hurts or because some feedback algorithm says withdraw if heat flux exceeds critical T? Natural selection doesn't care about motives. If impersonating something increases fitness, then nature will select good impersonators over bad ones. Keep it up long enough and no conscious being would be able to pick your zombie out of a crowd." Another silence. I could hear him chewing through it. "It'll even be able to participate in a conversation like this one. It could write letters home, impersonate real human feelings without having the slightest awareness of its own existence." "I don't know, Rob. It just seems... Oh, it might not be perfect. It might be a bit redundant or resort to occasional expository info dump. But even real people do that, don't they? And eventually there aren't any real people left, just robots pretending to give a shit. Perhaps. Depends on the population dynamics, among other things. But I'd guess that at least one thing an automaton lacks is empathy. If you can't feel, you can't really relate to something that does, even if you act as though you do. Which makes it interesting to note how many sociopaths show up in the world's upper echelons, How ruthlessness and bottom-line self-interest are so lauded up in the stratosphere, while anyone showing those traits at ground levels gets carted off into detention with the realists. Almost as if society itself is being reshaped from the inside out. Oh, come on, society was always pretty... Wait, you're saying the world's corporate elite are non-sentient? God, no, not nearly. Maybe they're just starting down that road, like chimpanzees. Yeah, but sociopaths don't blend in well. Maybe the ones that get diagnosed don't, but by definition they're the bottom of the class. The others are too smart to get caught, and real automatons would do even better. Besides, when you get powerful enough, you don't need to act like other people. Other people start acting like you." Sasha whistled. "Wow, perfect play actor. Or not so perfect. Sound like anyone we know?" They may have been talking about someone else entirely, I suppose. But that was as close as to a direct reference to Siri Keaton that I heard in all my hours on the grapevine. Nobody else mentioned me, even in passing. That was statistically unlikely, given what I just endured in front of them all. Someone should have said something. Perhaps Sadasti had ordered them not to discuss it. I didn't know why, but it was obvious by now that the vampire had been orchestrating their interactions with me for some time. Now I was in hiding, but he knew I'd listen in at some point. Maybe, for some reason, he didn't want my surveillance contaminated. He could have simply locked me out of consensus. He hadn't, which meant he still wanted me in the loop. Zombies. Automatons. Fucking sentience. For once in your goddamned life, understand something. He'd said that to me, or something had, during the assault. Understand that your life depends on it. Almost as if he were doing me a favor. Then he'd left me alone, and had evidently told the others to do the same. Are you listening, Keaton? And he hadn't locked me out of consensus. Centuries of navel-gazing. Millennia of masturbation. Plato to Descartes to Dawkins to Ronda. Souls and zombie agents and qualia. Kolmogorov complexity. Consciousness as divine spark. Consciousness as electromagnetic field. Consciousness as functional cluster. I explored it all. Wegner thought it was an executive summary. Penrose heard it in the singing of caged electrons. Niratronder said it was a fraud. Kazim called it leakage from a parallel universe. Metzinger wouldn't even admit it existed. The AIs claimed to have worked it out, then announced they couldn't explain it to us. Goodell was right after all. No system can fully understand itself. Not even the synthesists had been able to rotate it down. The load-bearing beams just couldn't take the strain. All of them, I began to realize, had missed the point. All those theories, all those drug dreams and experiments and models trying to prove what consciousness was, none to explain what it was good for. None needed, obviously. Consciousness makes us what we are. It lets us see the beauty and the ugliness. It elevates us into the exalted realm of the spiritual. Oh, a few outsiders, Dawkins, Coe, the occasional writer of hackwork fiction who barely achieved obscurity, wondered briefly at the why of it. Why not soft computers and no more? Why should non-sentient systems be inherently inferior? But they never really raised their voices above the crowd. The value of what we are was too trivially self-evident to ever call into question. Yet the questions persisted, in the minds of the laureates, in the angst of every horny 15-year-old on the planet. Am I nothing but spark and chemistry? Am I a magnet in the ether? Am I more than my eyes, my ears, my tongue? Am I the little thing behind those things, the thing looking out from inside? But who looks out from its eyes? What is it reduced to? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? What a stupid fucking question. I could have answered it in a second, if Sadasti hadn't forced me to understand it first. Not until we are lost do we begin to understand ourselves. Thoreau. The shame had scoured me and left me hollow. I didn't care who saw me. I didn't care what state they saw me in. For days I'd floated in my tent, curled into a ball and breathing my own stink while the others made whatever preparations my tormentor had laid out for them. Amanda Bates was the only one who'd ever even raised a token protest over what Sadasti had done to me. The others kept their eyes down and their mouths shut and did what he told them to do. Whether from fear or indifference, I couldn't tell. It was something I'd stopped caring about. Sometime during that span, the cast on my arm had cracked open like a shucked clam. I upped the lumens long enough to assess its handiwork. My repaired palm itched and glistened in twilight, a longer, deeper fate line running from heel to web, then back to darkness and the blind, unconvincing illusion of safety. Sadasti wanted me to believe. Somehow he must have thought the brutalizing and humiliating me would accomplish that broken and drained I would become an empty vessel to fill as he saw fit. Wasn't it a classic brainwashing technique, to shatter your victim and then glue the pieces back together in according to specs of your own choosing? Maybe he was expecting some kind of Stockholm syndrome to set in, or maybe his actions followed some agenda incomprehensible to mere meat. Maybe he'd simply gone insane. He had broken me. He had presented his arguments. I had followed his trail of breadcrumbs through consensus, through Theseus. And now, only 9 days from graduation, I knew one thing for sure. Sadasti was wrong. He had to be. I couldn't see how, but I knew just the same. He was wrong. Somehow, absurdly, that had become the one thing I did care about. No one in the spine. Only Cunningham visible in biomed, poring over digital dissections, pretending to kill time. I floated above him, my rebuilt hand clinging to the top of the nearest stairwell. It dragged me in a slow, small circle as the drum turned. Even from up there, I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, a system stuck in a holding pattern, corroding through the long hours as fate advanced with all the time in the world. He looked up. Ah, it lives. I fought the urge to retreat. Just a conversation, for God's sake. It's just two people talking. People do it all the time without your tools. You can do this. You can do this. Just try. So I forced one foot after another down the stairs, weight and apprehension rising in lockstep. I tried to read Cunningham's topology through the haze. Maybe I saw a facade, only microns deep. Maybe he would welcome almost any distraction, if he wouldn't admit it. Or maybe I was just imagining it. "How are you doing?" he asked as I reached the deck. I shrugged. "And all better, I see." "No thanks to you." I tried to stop that from coming out. Really. Cunningham struck a cigarette. "Actually, I was the one who fixed you up. You also sat there and watched while he took me apart. I wasn't even there." And then after a moment, "But you may be right. I might very well have sat it out in any event. Amanda and the gang did try to intervene on your behalf, from what I hear. Didn't do a lot of good for anyone. So you wouldn't even try. Would you, if the situation were reversed? Go unarmed against a vampire?" I said nothing. Cunningham regarded me for a long moment, dragging his cigarette. "He really got to you, didn't he said at last. "You're wrong," I said. "Am I? I don't play people." He seemed to consider the proposition. "What word would you prefer, then?" "I observe." "That you do. Some might even call it surveillance." I read body language," hoping that was all he was talking about. "It's a matter of degree, and you know it. Even in a crowd, there's a certain expectation of privacy. People aren't prepared to have their minds read off every twitch of the eyeball." He stabbed at the air with a cigarette. "And you're a shapeshifter. You present a different face to every one of us, and I'll wager none of them is real. The real you, if it even exists, is invisible." Something nodded below my diaphragm. "Who isn't? Who doesn't try to fit in? Who doesn't want to get along? There's nothing malicious about that. I'm a synthesist, for God's sake. I never manipulate the variables." "Well, see, that's the problem. It's not just variables you're manipulating." Smoke writhed between us. But I guess you can't really understand that, can you? He stood and waved a hand. Consensus windows imploded at his side. Not your fault, really. You can't blame someone for the way they're wired. Give me a fucking break, I snarled. His dead face showed nothing. That, too, had slipped out before I could stop it, and after that came the flood. You put so much fucking stock in that. You and your empathy. And maybe I am just some kind of imposter, but most people would swear I'd worn their very souls. I don't need that shit. You don't have to feel motives to deduce them. It's better if you can't. It keeps you... Dispassionate? Cunningham smiled faintly. Maybe your empathy is just a comforting lie. You ever think that? Maybe you think you know how the other person feels, but you're only feeling yourself. Maybe you're even worse than me. Or maybe we're all just guessing. Maybe the only difference is that I don't lie to myself about it. Do they look the way you imagined? He asked. What? What are you talking about? The scramblers. Multi-jointed arms from a central mass. Sounds rather similar to me. He'd been into Spindle's archives. Not really, I said. The arms are more flexible in real life. More segmented. And I never got a good look at the body. What does that have to do with... Close, though, wasn't it? Same size, same general body plan? So what? Why didn't you report it? I did. Isaac said it was just TMS from Rorschach. You saw them before Rorschach. Or at least, he continued, you saw something that scared you into blowing your cover, back when you were spying on Isaac and Michelle. My rage dissipated like air through a breach. They knew? Only Isaac, I think, and it kept it between it and the logs. I suspect it didn't want to interfere with your non-interference protocols, although I'd wager that was the last time you ever caught the two of them in private, yes? I didn't say anything. Did you think the official observer was somehow exempt from observation? Cunningham asked after a while. No, I said softly. I suppose not. He nodded. Have you seen any since? I'm not talking about the run-of-the-mill TMS hallucinations, I mean scramblers. Have you hallucinated any since you actually saw one in the flesh, since you knew what it looked like? I thought about it. No. He shook his head, some new opinion confirmed. You really are something, Keaton, you know that? You don't lie to yourself? Even now, you don't know what you know. What are you talking about? You figured it out. From Rorschach's architecture, probably. Form follows function, yes? Somehow you pieced together a fairly good idea of what a scrambler looked like before anyone had laid eyes on them. Or at least, he drew a breath, his cigarette flared like an LED. Part of you did. Some collection of unconscious modules working their asses off on your behalf. But they can't show their work, can they? You don't have conscious access to those levels. So one part of the brain tries to tell another any way it can. Passes notes under the table. Blindsight, I murmured. You just get a feeling of where to reach. More like schizophrenia, except you saw pictures instead of hearing voices. You saw pictures, and you still didn't understand. I blinked. But how would I mean... What did you think? That Theseus was haunted? That the scramblers were communing with you telepathically? What you do, it matters, Keaton. They told you were nothing but their stenographer, and they hammered all those layers of hands-off passivity into you, but you just had to take some initiative anyway, didn't you? Had to work out the problem on your own. The only thing you couldn't do was admit it to yourself. Cunningham shook his head. Siri Keaton, see what they've done to you. He touched his face. See what they've done to us all, he whispered. I found the gang floating in the center of the darkened observation blister. She made room as I joined her, pushed to one side, and anchored herself to a bit of webbing. Susan? I asked. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. I'll get her, Michelle said. No, that's all right. I'd like to speak to all of... But Michelle had already fled. The half-lit figure changed before me and said, she'd rather be alone right now. I nodded. You? James shrugged. I don't mind talking, although I'm surprised you're still doing your reports after... I'm not exactly. This isn't for Earth. I looked around. Not much to see. Faraday mesh coated the inside of the dome like a gray film, dimming and graining the view beyond. Ben hung like a black malignancy across half the sky. I could make out a dozen dim contrails against vague bands of cloud in reds so deep they bordered on black. The sun winked past James's shoulder, our sun, a bright dot that diffracted into faint splintered rainbows when I moved my head. That was pretty much it. Starlight didn't penetrate the mesh, nor did the larger, dimmer particles of the accretion belt. The myriad dim pinpoints of shovel-nosed machinery were lost utterly. Which might be a comfort to some, I supposed. Shitty view, I remarked. Theseus could have projected crisp first-person vistas across the dome in an instant, more real than real. Michelle likes it, James said. The way it feels. And Cruncher likes the diffraction effects. He likes interference patterns. We watched nothing for a while, but the dim half-light filtering out from the spine. It brushed the edges of James' profile. You set me up, I said at last. She looked at me. What do you mean? You were talking around me all along, weren't you? All of you. You didn't bring me in until I'd been, how would she put it? Preconditioned. The whole thing was planned to throw me off balance. And then Sadasti attacks me out of nowhere, and we didn't know about that, not until the alarm went off. Alarm? When he changed the gas mix, you must have heard it. Isn't that why you were there? He called me to his tent. He told me to watch. She regarded me from a face full of shadow. You didn't try to stop him? I couldn't answer the accusation in her voice. I just observe, I said weakly. I thought you were trying to stop him from... She shook her head. That's why I thought he was attacking you. You're saying that wasn't an act? You weren't in on it? I didn't believe it. But I could tell she did. I thought you were trying to protect them. She snorted a soft, humorless laugh at her own mistake and looked away. I guess I should have known better. She should have. She should have known that taking orders is one thing. Taking sides would have done nothing but compromise my integrity. And I should have been used to it by now. I forged on. It was some kind of object lesson. A tutorial. You can't torture the non-sentient or something, and I heard you, Susan. It wasn't news to you. It wasn't news to anyone except me, and you hid it from me. You all did. You and your gang, and Amanda too. You've been hashing this out for days, and you went out of your way to cover it up. How did I miss it? How did I miss it? Yuka told us not to discuss it with you, Susan admitted. Why? This is exactly the kind of thing I'm out here for. He said you'd resist, unless it was handled properly. Handled? Susan, he assaulted me. You saw what he... We didn't know he was going to do that. None of us did. And he did it why? To win an argument? That's what he says. Do you believe him? Probably. After a moment she shrugged. Who knows? He's a vampire. He's opaque. But his record, I mean, he's never resorted to overt violence before. She shook her head. Why should he? He doesn't have to convince the rest of us of anything. We have to follow his orders regardless. So do I reminded her. He's not trying to convince you, Siri. Ah. I was only a conduit after all. Sadasti hadn't been making his case to me at all. He'd been making it through me, and he was planning for a second round. Why go to such extremes to present a case to Earth if Earth was irrelevant? Sadasti didn't expect the game to end out here. He expected Earth to do something in light of his perspective. But what difference does it make? I wondered aloud. She looked at me. Even if he's right, how does it change anything? How does this, I raised my repaired hand, change anything? Scramblers are intelligent whether they're sentient or not. They're a potential threat either way. We still don't know, so what difference does it make? Why did he do this to me? How does it matter? Susan raised her face to Big Ben and didn't answer. Sasha returned to face me and tried to. It matters, she said, because it means we attacked them before Theseus was launched. Before Firefall, even. We attacked the... You don't get it, do you? You don't. Sasha snorted softly. If that isn't the fucking funniest thing I've heard in my whole short life. She leaned forward, bright-eyed. Imagine you're a scrambler and you encounter a human signal for the very first time. Her stare was almost predatory. I resisted the urge to back away. It should be so easy for you, Keaton. It should be the easiest gig you've ever had. Aren't you the user interface? Aren't you the Chinese room? Aren't you the one who never has to look inside, never has to walk a mile in anyone's shoes because you figure everything out from their surfaces? She stared at Ben's dark, smoldering disk. Well, there's your dream date. There's a whole race of nothing but surfaces. There's no inside to figure out. All the rules are right up front. So go to work, Siri Keaton. Make us proud. There was no contempt in Sasha's voice, no disdain. There wasn't even anger, not in her voice, not in her eyes. There was pleading. There were tears. "Imagine you're a scrambler," she whispered again, as they floated like tiny perfect beads before her face. "Imagine you're a scrambler. Imagine you have intellect but no insight, agendas but no awareness. Your circuitry hums with strategies for survival and persistence, flexible, intelligent, even technological, but no other circuitry monitors it. You can think of anything, yet are conscious of nothing. You can't imagine such a being, can you? The term being doesn't even seem to apply in some fundamental way you can't quite put your finger on. Try. Imagine that you encounter a signal. It is structured and dense with information. It meets all the criteria of an intelligent transmission. Evolution and sentience offer a wide variety of paths to follow, branch points in the flowcharts that handle such input. Sometimes these signals come from conspecifics who have useful information to share, whose lives you'll defend according to the rules of kin selection. Sometimes they come from competitors or predators or other inimical entities that must be avoided or destroyed. In those cases, the information may prove of significant tactical value. Some signals may even arise from entities which, while not kin, can still serve as allies or symbionts in mutually beneficial pursuits. You can derive appropriate responses for any of these eventualities and many others. You decode the signals and stumble. I had a great time. I really enjoyed him, even if he cost twice as much as any other hooker in the dome. To fully appreciate Kesey's quartet, they hate us for our freedom. Pay attention now. Understand. There are no meaningful translations for these terms. They are needlessly recursive. They contain no usable intelligence, yet they are structured intelligently. There is no chance they could have arisen by chance. The only explanation is that something has coded nonsense in a way that poses as a useful message. Only after wasting time and effort does the deception become apparent. The signal functions to consume the resources of a recipient for zero payoff and reduced fitness. The signal is a virus. Viruses do not arise from kin, symbionts, or other allies. The signal is an attack. And it's coming from right about there. "Now you get it," Sasha said. I shook my head, trying to wrap it around that insane, impossible conclusion. They're not even hostile. Not even capable of hostility. Just so profoundly alien they couldn't help but treat human language itself as a form of combat. How do you say we come in peace when the very words are an act of war? That's why they won't talk to us, I realized. Only if Yuka's right. He may not be. It was James again, still quietly resisting, still unwilling to concede a point that even her other selves had accepted. I could see why. Because if Sadasti was right, scramblers were the norm. Evolution across the universe was nothing but endless proliferation of automatic, organized complexity, a vast arid Turing machine full of self-replicating machinery forever unaware of its own existence. And we were the flukes and the fossils. We were the flightless birds lauding our own mastery over some remote island while serpents and carnivores washed up on our shores. Susan James could not bring herself to concede that point, because Susan James, her multiple lives built on the faith that communication resolves all conflict, would then be forced to admit the lie. If Sadasti was right, there was no hope of reconciliation. A memory rose into my mind and stuck there. A man in motion, head bent, mouth twisted in an unrelenting grimace. His eyes focused on one foot, then the other. His legs moved stiffly, carefully. His arms moved not at all. He lurched like a zombie in thrall to rigor mortis. I knew what it was. Proprioreceptive polyneuropathy, a case study I'd encountered in Consensus back before Spindle had died. This was what Pag had once compared me to, a man who had lost his mind. Only self-awareness remained. Deprived of the unconscious sense and subroutines he had always taken for granted, he had to focus on each and every step across the room. His body no longer knew where its limbs were or what they were doing. To move at all, to even remain upright, he had to bear constant witness. There'd been no sound when I played the file. There was none now in its recollection. But I swore I could feel Sadasti at my shoulder, peering into my memories. I swore I heard him speak in my mind like a schizophrenic hallucination. This is the best that consciousness can do when left on its own. Right answer, I murmured. Wrong question. What? Stretch, remember? When you asked it which objects were in the window? And it missed the scrambler, James nodded. So? It didn't miss the scrambler. You thought you were asking about the things it saw, things that existed on the board. Stretch thought you were asking about the things it was aware of, she finished. He's right, I whispered. Oh, God. I think he's right. Hey, James said, did you see that? But I never saw what she was pointing at. Theseus slammed its eyelids shut and started howling. Graduation came 9 days early.